Disappointment. I wanted to learn more about Uriah's plans because I really wanted to help Agnes. So I invited him to coffee one day while he was in London. We shook hands as soon as we met, and I noticed that his hand was cold and wet. Everything about him was unpleasant. Uriah accepted my invitation by saying,
"How very kind of you, Mr. Copperfield. I'm too humble to accept your invitation, but I would like it."
As we sat down in my flat to have coffee, he looked at me and said,
"Perhaps you've already heard that I'm going to become Mr. Wickfield's partner?"
"Yes," I replied. "Agnes told me."
"I'm glad she did,"
he said, smiling.
"You know, I've always helped poor Mr. Wickfield with his work. During these years, he's been very careless with it, but I solved all his problems. I admire him greatly, and, in spite of my humble position, I'm in love with beautiful Miss Agnes, and I hope to marry her one day."
I was furious. I really wanted to hit his ugly face. But I thought of Agnes, and I tried to be calm. "Have you spoken to Agnes about your love yet?" I asked, looking at his evil eyes.
"Oh no, Mr. Copperfield. Not yet,"
he said humbly.
"I'll wait until I'm her father's partner."
Uriah had power over Mr. Wickfield and his daughter now. Could Agnes ever marry such a worthless insect? I continued to work for Mr. Spenlow, who was an excellent lawyer, and I learnt a lot about the law. One day he invited me to spend the weekend at his country house outside London. He lived here with his daughter Dora, because his wife was dead. He introduced me to her, and I fell in love with her. She was beautiful and gentle, with long blonde hair and lively blue eyes. I couldn't stop looking at her. I was very surprised when Dora introduced me to her companion.
"I'd like you to meet my new companion, Miss Murdstone,"
said Dora.
"She came to look after me when my mother died."
Miss Murdstone seemed embarrassed to see me, but I didn't think about her because my only thoughts were for Dora. One evening we were walking together in the garden when Dora said,
"You know, David, I hate Miss Murdstone. My father pays her to look after me, but she's unpleasant and terribly strict."
While I was walking around London one day, I met my old friend Tommy Traddles. He was living in a poor part of London, and he was studying to become a lawyer. I discovered that he knew Mr. and Mrs. Micawber and that they were back in London. I went to visit them because they were good people and I liked them. They were very happy to see me, but unfortunately they still had money problems. One evening, Steerforth came to see me. "It's good to see you, Steerforth," I said. "Come and sit down."
"Thanks, David,"
he said quietly. There was something strange about him that I couldn't understand. At first, he seemed sad, and then, a minute later, he was laughing. "Where have you been?" I asked.
"I've just been to Yarmouth,"
he said.
"I have bad news for you. Old Barkis is very ill."
"Oh, no," I said. "Not old Barkis."
"Yes,"
Steerforth replied sadly.
"and the doctor thinks he'll die soon."
"Poor Peggotty," I exclaimed. "She'll be so sad without him. I must leave for Yarmouth now. I want to see them."
"Yes, that's a good idea,"
said Steerforth. He got up and threw back his handsome head. Then he put his hands on my shoulders and said,
"Goodbye, David. Promise me that if anything ever happens to me, you'll always think well of me. Please promise me that."
"Steerforth, you know I'll always admire you," I said, trying to understand what he meant. The morning after I got to Yarmouth, Mr. Barkis died and left Peggotty all his money. The evening before the funeral, Peggotty, Daniel and I met at the old boat. I was surprised to see that Ham and Emily were not there. Then Ham called me outside the front door of his house. He was holding a letter in his hand, and he was desperate. "What's wrong, Ham?" I asked, looking at him.
"David, please read this letter from little Emily,"
he said, his voice shaking.
Dear Ham, please forgive me. I am running away and leaving you and Uncle Daniel. When you read this, I'll be far away and I'll never return home unless he marries me. I'm truly sorry if I broke your heart. I'm a bad woman. Forgive me, Emily.
Ham and I were both shocked. When he told Daniel, who loved his little Emily more than anyone in the world, he was furious.
"Who's the man?"
Daniel shouted angrily.
"I want to know his name."
Ham and I looked at each other and we couldn't speak. I was so upset and disappointed.
"Is his name Steerforth? Tell me!"
Daniel shouted again.
"It is!"
cried Ham wildly.
"Today, people saw him and Emily going away in his coach. I'm sorry, David, but that Steerforth is such an evil man."
I looked at poor Ham and felt terribly disappointed by Steerforth's behaviour. Daniel Peggotty suddenly looked older and said,
"I'm going to look for her and bring her back home. Don't try to stop me. I'm travelling to London, France, and all over the world until I find her. If something happens to me, tell little Emily that I forgive her and that my love for her is always the same."
He took his coat, hat, stick and bag and left the house. Nothing could stop him.